There are places where silence doesn't feel natural. It feels held, contained, as if the land itself is waiting, not for people, but for something else. Time, memory, or maybe something that never quite left. Greenough in Western Australia is a place defined by space. Wide open land stretches in every direction. Homes sit far apart, separated not just by roads, but by distance itself. It's the kind of quiet that lingers, that settles into everything around it. In places like this, what happens inside a home can remain there, unseen, unheard, and unknown, until it isn't. There are nights that pass unnoticed, quiet nights. Nights where everything seems ordinary, almost mundane. But the night of 20 February 1993 began like that for the Mackenzie family. Their rural home isolated on the outskirts of Greenough. It sat surrounded by wide fields. The distance between neighbours long enough that the quiet seemed absolute. Inside the house, Karen Mackenzie moved through her usual evening routines. Perhaps she tidied the lounge room, checked on the children, made sure everyone was settled for the night. Her daughters Amara 7 and Katrina 5 were tucked into their beds. The rooms were calm. The children were breathing evenly in sleep. Daniel, 16, lay awake, perhaps reading, perhaps lost in thought, restless in the stillness of the early morning. He was the only one awake, the only one aware of the world outside his room. Meanwhile, William Patrick Mitchell, a local farmhand known to the family, had spent the evening consuming alcohol, cannabis, and amphetamines. His mind clouded by coordination, altered, but his intentions were deliberate. And by around 3 a.m, he had set out for the Mackenzie property. The darkness of the countryside was complete. The quiet stretched across the fields, broken only by the soft hum of a car engine. Daniel noticed the headlights sweeping across the yard, and he stepped outside. He was curious. What he likely expected was someone familiar, someone he could recognise, a neighbour perhaps, or a local friend. Instead, he was met with violence. Mitchell approached carrying a tomahawk-style axe. He struck quickly, decisively. Daniel was the first to be attacked. The confrontation was brief, chaotic, and fatal. Outside on the gravel driveway, Daniel would later be found, the first victim of a night that would claim an entire family. Inside, the house waited in its quiet. Karen slept in the lounge room, unaware. Mitchell entered the home with purpose. She was attacked and killed, and after her death, he sexually interfered with her using a tube of hand lotion. A deliberate and horrifying act that would later become one of the key facts linking him to the crime. In their bedrooms, Amara and Katrina slept soundly. They had no warning. In minutes, both were killed. The violence was swift and the outcome absolute. The night had begun so ordinarily. It ended in horror and silence. 4 lives erased in a single home in a matter of minutes. When the acts were complete, Mitchell left. He disposed of the axe in the Greenough River, removing the weapon from the scene. The house, inside and out, returned to stillness. Nothing moved. Nothing called out. No one could. Outside, the world remained dark and silent. Fields stretched away from the house, empty, untouched. Yet inside, the lives of a mother and her children had been destroyed. The quiet that had been ordinary now carried weight. It was different, tense, heavy. The kind of silence that lingers after something cannot be undone. Even as the night continued, the impact of those early hours had already settled. Invisible, but complete. The first line of mourning in Greenough is gentle. It creeps across the wide fields, touches the rooftops, brushes the trees. On most days, it signals ordinary routines. Chores, breakfast, the slow unfolding of a new day. But this morning was not ordinary. Friends of Karen Mackenzie had planned to arrive early, ready to help with renovations on the house. The morning was calm, the sun just beginning to rise, the air crisp and still. From a distance, the house looked like any other rural property, quiet, unremarkable, unchanged. Then they saw him, Daniel, lying on the gravel driveway. At first, disbelief, confusion. It didn't make sense. As they drew closer, the reality became undeniable. Daniel was badly injured, and he wasn't breathing. Fear pressed against them. Their instinct was to check inside, to call out for Karen. But the house offered only silence. No movement, no sound. Only stillness stretching from room to room. They left immediately to get help. The weight of isolation pressing down. In rural areas, help is not minutes away. It must be reached. Every second matters. When emergency services arrived, the scene inside confirmed their worst fears. Karen Mackenzie lay dead in the lounge room. Amara and Katrina lay in their bedrooms. 4 lives, all gone. The property, once ordinary and domestic, was now defined by absence. The early morning light touched the house, but it couldn't illuminate the loss within. The quiet of the rural landscape remained, but it carried a new meaning. One of grief, of horror, and of something broken that could never be restored. The day began, but for the Mackenzie home, life had already ended. When authorities were contacted, the information was limited. A young person found inside a home, unresponsive and concerned for others inside. Uncertainty about what had happened, but that was enough. Police were dispatched to the property, responding not to confirmed facts, but to a situation that was clearly serious. When they arrived, they were met with the same sight. Daniel lying on the gravel. And from that moment, the situation began to shift from uncertainty into confirmation. Officers assessed the scene. Their first priority was safety. They needed to determine whether there was any ongoing threat, whether anyone else was in danger, and whether it was safe to proceed. Once that was established, attention turned to the house. Entry was made. Inside, the reality of what had happened became clear. Karen Mackenzie was found deceased. Further search of the home revealed the 2 children. All 3 had been killed. And at that point, the situation was no longer unclear. It was no longer a question of what might have happened. It was a confirmed multiple homicide. 4 victims, all within the same family in a single, isolated location. The property became a crime scene, and from there, everything changed. The area was secured. Access was restricted. Movement was controlled. Additional units were called in, including forensic investigators and crime scene specialists. The scale of the case required it. Before anything was moved, everything was documented. Photographs were taken, notes were recorded, measurements were made. The goal was to preserve the scene exactly as it had been found, because once it was altered, it could never be returned to its original state. Investigators began making initial observations, positions of the victim, signs of movement, points of entry. The absence of forced entry suggested something important, that whoever had entered the home hadn't needed to force their way in. Attention turned to what was missing. The weapon used in the attack was not present at the scene, and that absence suggested that it had been removed, taken away after the crime. That in turn suggested planning, awareness, movement beyond the immediate act. From there, the process of reconstruction began, and slowly, piece by piece, the investigation began to take shape. As investigators began to build a picture of what had happened, one factor stood out almost immediately. There were no signs of forced entry. The home hadn't been broken into, and nothing suggested a struggle at the point of access. Whoever had come onto the property had been able to move freely, approaching the house without resistance. And in a rural setting like Greenough, that detail carries weight because it narrows possibility. It suggests familiarity. It suggests that the person responsible either knew the family or knew the property well enough to approach it without hesitation. From that point, the focus of the investigation began to shift towards people within that circle. Known associates, workers, anyone who had reason to be on or near the property. At the same time, forensic work continued at the scene. Every area of the home was examined. Every surface, every position, every detail was recorded and analysed. Investigators were working to reconstruct movement, what had happened, in what order, and how quickly. Outside, Daniel's position on the gravel was documented in detail. Inside, the layout of the house became part of the reconstruction. Movement between rooms, points of contact, sequences that couldn't be established through physical evidence. The smallest details began to matter. At first, they were just traces, easily overlooked, easily dismissed in the chaos of the scene. But in forensic hands, nothing was meaningless. A smear, a partial impression, a trace left behind in a moment that would never be repeated. Among the evidence collected was residue from personal items, things that under normal circumstances would go unnoticed. But here they became part of something much larger, a silent thread connecting movement, contact, and presence within the house. And then there was the print, a palm impression pressed into the wall with enough clarity to demand attention. Not just a mark, but a moment captured, a presence confirmed. For investigators, this was the beginning of something crucial. Because while the scene itself had fallen into stillness, the evidence hadn't. It spoke. While forensic teams continued their work, investigators began tracing recent movements connected to the family. Who had seen them last? Who had spoken to them? Who had been in the area? While the investigation was underway, funerals were being held. Funerals in rural communities have a rhythm of their own. They bring people together in grief, remembrance, and solidarity. In Greenough, the loss of Karen Mackenzie and her 3 children was felt across the district. Friends, neighbours, and extended family arrived. The service was meant to honour the lives that had been lost, to offer comfort to those who remained. The church was filled with hushed voices, with tears, and with quiet presence of a community trying to make sense of a tragedy so sudden and so incomprehensible. Among the mourners was William Patrick Mitchell, a familiar face in the area. At the time, no one could have imagined the connection that he would later have to that night. He sat among them, observing, silent, blending in with the other grieving faces. Every detail carried weight. Photographs of happy moments. Small gestures meant to celebrate the lives that were gone. The air was heavy with sorrow, but also with a need to come together to support one another in grief. In a small town like Greenough, where everyone knows one another, the ripple effects of such a crime are profound. Homes feel different. Streets seem emptier. Familiar faces carry weight that they did not before. The community had been shaken, not just by the loss, but by the sense that something ordinary, familiar, and safe had been irrevocably broken. The funerals passed quietly. People spoke in low tones afterward, comforting one another, sharing memories of Karen and her children, and holding on to the knowledge that their absence would be felt every day from that point forward. Outside, the sun rose over the fields, bright and indifferent. Life in the rural town moved on. But for those who had loved the Mackenzies, the world would never feel the same. The grief lingered, quiet but persistent. And among those gathered, one presence would later be seen in a chilling new light. It went unnoticed, a single figure attending the farewell of lives he had destroyed, hidden in plain sight. In the days following the funerals, the grief in Greenough remained raw. Families and neighbours tried to reconcile the violence of the night with the ordinary rhythm of life. But amid the mourning, questions lingered. Who could have done such a thing? How could a family be taken so completely in a place that felt safe, familiar, and remote? At the time, there were no answers. The community had no reason to suspect anyone in particular. Investigators arrived gathering what evidence they could from the property, but the identity of the perpetrator remained unknown. Forensic work slowly began to build a picture. Among the crucial details noted was the absence of the hand lotion, a small but significant piece of evidence connected to the sexual assault of Karen Mackenzie. Mitchell had taken it with him, leaving only traces behind. The tomahawk-style axe used to commit these murders was also missing from the property, disposed of elsewhere. These absences suggested a disturbing level of awareness and planning. Through careful reconstruction, investigators focused on William Patrick Mitchell, a man familiar to the area. There were no witnesses to the crime. The case relied entirely on forensic evidence, the reconstruction of the scene, and Mitchell's own statements. When confronted, Mitchell confessed. He admitted to the murders of Karen Mackenzie and her 3 children, as well as the sexual assault of Karen. He told investigators that he'd consumed alcohol, cannabis, and amphetamines prior to the crime, providing context to his state of mind, though there was no testing to confirm this. His account included actions that only the offender could have known, the sequence of attacks, and the disposal of the axe in the Greenough River. The confession aligned with the evidence gathered, confirming the horrifying events that occurred in the isolated home. The recovery of the axe from the river provided the final physical link to the crime. Combined with Mitchell's confession and forensic evidence, the case became irrefutable. Once in custody, Mitchell was formally charged with the murders of Karen and her children, as well as the sexual assault of Karen. Some details of the evidence were so horrific, they've been sealed by the judge, limiting public access to the most sensitive aspects of the crime. The community, still grieving, now had a name attached to the tragedy. Someone who had remained unseen, unobserved, even in the days following the crime. The legal process followed, with evidence compiled, statements recorded, and psychiatric assessments conducted. The court considered his admitted drug and alcohol use as context, but it did not diminish responsibility. Ultimately, Mitchell entered a guilty plea for all 4 murders and the sexual assault. The court imposed 4 consecutive life sentences, reflecting the gravity of his crimes. Even as justice was delivered, the echoes of that night, the violence, the isolation, the loss, continued to ripple through Greenough. The landscape remained the same, but the memory of what had happened marked every home, every street, and every person who had known the Mackenzie family. There's something about cases like this. The more you hear, the harder it is to look away. Because this isn't just content. It's real people, real stories, and most of the time they fade. This show exists so they don't fade. And the only reason it keeps existing is because there are people listening right now who choose to keep it going. Not everyone does, but the ones who do, they're the reason these stories get told properly. So if you've ever listened and felt like this matters, there's a way to be part of that. There's a Patreon, and there's merch on the website. No pressure, but if you know, you know. Now let's go back to what happened next. The process had moved from incident to investigation to court and finally to the outcome. But outside of the legal system, the story doesn't end there. Because cases like this do not exist only within files or court records. They exist in memory, in place, in the way a location is understood after something like this happens. Even now, the land around Greenough seems unchanged. Fields stretch wide, the roads remain long, homes sit far apart. But for those who know what happened that night, nothing feels ordinary anymore. The quiet is heavier. The air carries memory, and the knowledge of what unfolded lingers, unseen but impossible to ignore. For William Patrick Mitchell, the legal system had done its work. Life sentences were in place. The sexual assault charge sealed by the judge to protect the privacy of the victims. The community had a name for the person who had taken so much, and yet, even with the courtroom verdicts, the absence of Karen and her children couldn't be replaced. Justice had been administered, but it didn't return what was lost. In small towns like Greenough, people notice the details. A gate left open, a light burning longer than usual, familiar faces that carry a shadow of the past. Grief never truly leaves. It adapts, becomes part of the rhythm of life. And in this case, that rhythm had been permanently altered. The Mackenzies' family is not just about crime or punishment or even tragedy. It's about the presence and the absence, about the way violence can intersect with ordinary life in a place defined by space and silence, about the weight of what happens when the ordinary is broken. What we recount today is more than a story. It's a record. It's a memory preserved in words, in voice, in attention. Because if it's not remembered, if it's not told fully, it risks disappearing. And for Karen Mackenzie, Amara, Katrina, and Daniel, their presence, their lives, their ordinary nights and mornings, they cannot disappear. So we speak, we listen, we bear witness. And in that there is meaning. Not to replace what was lost, not to fix what cannot be fixed, but to ensure that it is remembered correctly fully, truthfully. The silence of Greenough may still stretch across the fields, but for those who know the story, it is never empty. It holds memory, grief, and the weight of what happened on that night. It holds lessons. It holds a reminder of fragility. And above all, it holds a witness to lives that ended far too soon. And so, as we leave Greenough behind in words, remember this: the quiet is not always calm. The stillness is not always safe. And some nights, some events, leave traces that last far longer than anyone expects. Even now, long after the events of the 21st of February 1993, the silence still carries a story. Because for some people, this is not just a story to hear. It's a story to remember. And in remembering, we honour those who can't speak for themselves. If you feel that weight, there are ways to support the show. Patreon, merch, and spreading awareness. No pressure, but for every listener who carries these stories, ensures they do not disappear. Until next time, stay aware and never look away.